So Argent Boulevard, I can't walk my dog without somebody coming up to me and complaining about Argent Boulevard. 170, I even hear from the officials in Beaufort, their people are complaining about the commute now to Hilton Head and Bluff. How long it's taking. 278, we're just, Margaritaville is just the tip of the iceberg of what has been approved that will affect that car. So now as these projects come up, we at the city council, we're concerned not about the projects, about public safety. And we're not the experts. We're here just trying to make the best decision we can and what impact that's going to have 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so we have questions. We want to take a macro view. What's the cumulative effect of all these things that we've done in the last 6 years? And they're going vertical. How do we deal with the impact? Not just the impact of these individual developments. Yes, we have to deal with that, but it adds on to all the other things. It's a bigger picture than just each individual project that we have to approve. And most importantly, it's not about what we can do. It's about what's safe for those particular points. How do we make it safe for all our residents and all the people from the region who passes by those places? Big question is, what can we ask of these developers who want these projects? And we want to respect everybody's right to develop. The property rights of the owners and the businesses, we encourage these businesses. We want them, and we respect what their objectives are. But what can we ask them to do to help us with the primary goal of public safety? And how far can we ask them to contribute to that ultimate goal? These are all questions that we as a city council have been asking us as each one of these come up. And we've had some tough and controversial and disruptive decisions that we've made since the spring and summer of 2021. And it's caused us a lot of agony. We've caused agony with the developers and agony with the county. But every one of those situations and disagreements are all stemmed by one thing: this council's concern for public safety. And so this is so important to us. Can't thank you enough for coming. I want to thank everybody who's been patient with the city council trying to come up with answers to these tough questions. And we appreciate whatever help you can give us, because we're asking for your help. We want to do the right thing for our citizens. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and we'll go to the first item on the agenda.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Just a couple introductory comments, and everybody can read my agenda. This was my agenda, and I try to clear it with everybody in the know, so we have a really good understanding of what our goals were today. But again, thank you. I don't know how often you folks travel out of Charleston and make appearances at local governments, but again, we really appreciate you coming down and talking to us. I think the biggest thing here, just for my purpose, is demystifying, I guess, the encroachment process, how traffic and impact analysis are looked at, what the role is of local government in that whole process. And I think if we can just have the feedback and your expertise about how the process works, what it's based upon, what our role is, so again, can help our council and our elected officials and our planning commissioners make better decisions moving forward. So again, we can start out, and the first part of it is, if I don't know who's going to speak on behalf of DOT, but just talk about how the encroachment permit process works, what goes into making determinations on what traffic mitigation is determined during the encroachment process? And again, how does local government involvement or role in that process?
So I'll address the encroachment permit process.
You ought to tell us what you do at
Oh,
the,
sure.
yeah.
Absolutely. I'm Julie Fleming. I'm the district permit engineer in District 6 at SCDOT, and I review the larger commercial permits, residential, commercial development.
Thank you.
I'm Tim Henderson. I'm the District Engineering Administrator for District 6 for SCDOT. As a division administrator, the DOT is broken up in the state with 6 engineering districts. Each of those districts at the top has a, we call a DEA, which is what I am, the District Engineering Administrator. And under that administrator, I have different divisions of our district maintenance engineer, district traffic engineer, our district construction engineer, we have a district permit engineer. So my job is to kind of manage those folks and those different aspects of the DOT in the 6 counties that we are. So I've got, roughly about 500 something employees in District 6. So we keep busy. Most of my job, I've got over 29 years with DOT. Most of it was in the construction part of it. For the last 6 years, roughly, I've been the DEA. So I've kind of gotten away from the construction. I found out the DEA, most of my job is dealing with, the maintenance part of it. Folks, doing all the complaining basically with all the drainage and getting the grass, getting the litter, the yada yada. It's a lot of, that gets funneled up to district, and then I report directly to Chief Andy Leapard up in Columbia. But for permits, we talk about commercial permits, big permits. Julie, she's our district, she's over the 6 counties. She has a few engineers under her that look at permits and work through her. Josh is, and I'll let Josh, he wants to talk about the traffic part of it, but a lot of the things of these big permits are traffic analysis that he has to review. That's kind of the DOT in a nutshell.
Thank you.
I'm Josh Johnson. I'm everybody's favorite and least favorite.
Here's your card electronically.
So I'm the district traffic engineer which does a lot of things, but for the purpose of today's discussion, when there's development, requires a traffic study, I review that, make sure it's in compliance with accepted standards for producing such documents, and then determine what mitigation is going to be required by those developments.
Thank all of you.
Hey, Josh, there's one thing I got to dispute. I'm the least favorite. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So as far as the encroachment permit process goes for these larger residential developments, commercial developments, we ask that they come to us with a preliminary site plan. We look at it, determine how large it is. If it needs a traffic study, we consult with Josh, the district traffic engineer. We ask that they get with Josh on creating their traffic study. He gives them parameters. I'll let him go into those details. And once they have gotten their traffic study completed, Josh has reviewed it and approved it. And then at that point, they come to us for an encroachment permit with full construction plans, roadway plans, and we start our review at that point for the encroachment permit. I know that's kind of a high level, but I could certainly explain any more of that if there are any questions. Usually, so our preliminary review takes about a week, and then really creating the traffic study, the construction plans for submittal, that's really dependent on the engineer creating those. And then our review times are usually under 30 days. And they go through several review processes, several iterations of review. So usually they get their encroachment permit within 3 to 6 months, depending on how long other agencies have taken.
And what are you looking for when you are reviewing a permit application?
So with what I'm looking for impacts to the right of way, how the drainage is impacted based on what they're doing, what their driveways look like, their turn lanes, if they're designed properly with, recognized engineering standards. We just make sure they meet our requirements. We have an ARMS manual, which is our access and roadside management standards. It outlines driveway spacing, lane widths, radii. It has a, sight distance, and we use that manual kind of like, it's our standard that we use. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that they meet our standards, that their driveways are spaced appropriately, do they have proper sight distance? And does their drainage work? Or they want to make sure they're not increasing any kind of drainage in our right of way.
One of the things that we struggle with, and I know talking to our planning commission, we all struggle. And we understand there's certain standards for everything. But is there any consideration to the specific site? In other words, these manual requirements are part of what you deal with, your yardstick, the measure. But is there any consideration that the site that is in question has a different set of circumstances that would require a different yardstick? I hope I'm clear.
No, I understand completely. So honestly, I look at all of them differently. They're all different. They all have different frontages. They all have different driveway spacings. The surrounding area is all different. And so we look at them individually. They all have, the access to the road, that the ADT or the traffic on the daily traffic on the road that they're connecting to is always different too. So we're looking at them all differently. Now, our standards are basically the same, but we're looking at the characteristics of the site itself and comparing them to our standards. So yes, our requirements can vary based on the characteristics of the site.
Thank you. Any other questions?
From a traffic standpoint, first off, I guess I'll give a little more introduction into me. So whether it's a public or politicians or other agencies, sometimes people I think feel that state government employees just like come from nowhere. They just appear and they show up in their office and they do their work and they have blinders to everything. But I'm a member of a community. I serve in a community. I was on planning commission and served as a chair of planning commission 4 years in the city of Goose Creek before I moved a couple years ago. So I see these things not just as the traffic engineer for DOT, but for everything else. But at the same time, my role as a district traffic engineer is to protect the interests of the DOT road network, and public safety, to your point, is a major component to that, specifically traffic safety. At the same time, being the state government employee bound by what state law dictates that we can and can't do when it comes to access and so forth. So if we have a set of standards that are outlined for access to a project and it meets our requirements, meets requirements of state law, then we have to provide them access. We also don't get to dictate to them necessarily that their project is the wrong type. I know you want to build a Walmart, but we really think this should be a oil change facility, right? Just like when you guys deal with zoning, whatever it's zoned for, they have a right to build whatever it's zoned for from that list, right? So with that, we kind of have to work with the hands that we're dealt. So what I do whenever I'm looking at a site, we're approached, there's going to be an encroachment permit. It's going to rise to a level where a traffic study is going to be required. So it needs that preliminary review from me. I'm looking at what that site is going to generate in terms of trips. There's nationally accepted formulas to calculate of different types what that site is expected to generate in terms of traffic in and out. Now, there's some uniqueness to a specific site or a specific business. Chick-fil-A does not fall under the fast food restaurant of these numbers, right? So we know when we're dealing with a Chick-fil-A, and they know that their numbers are a little bit different than what those nationally accepted standards are. But for the most part, as engineers, as traffic engineers who are doing these studies, that's where they're gonna be going by, because that is, from an engineering perspective, what is the accepted practice. So the traffic study scope that is generally dictated by my office, is based on how many of these trips are gonna be generated. The more traffic that's gonna be generated, the larger that scope, the farther out that the study needs to look to evaluate traffic. Because if you think about how that traffic refracts as it goes through the network, it gets lesser and lesser. Now, eventually, all traffic leads to 278, or I-26, or I-95. It's not feasible, possible, reasonable to require a developer to go evaluate whether I-95 needs to be 3 lanes. We can already say, we need that, right? So at some point, that scope does have to end when the amount of traffic generated from that site, exiting that site or entering it, is going and dispersing to a point where the impacts are minimal or small enough that it wouldn't be reasonable to require an improvement of that particular intersection. So that's how the scope of the study is generally defined. I will say that there are some local governments in our district that have their own ordinances regarding traffic studies. They sometimes require more in their studies than we do, and they sometimes require more improvements than we do. We have, for instance, charts that show you plot a point, turn lane needed at this axis. There are certain local governments in the state that require it when there's less traffic making those turns. So it's not always the scope that I come up with. Sometimes someone else requires more than what I would ordinarily require. But as they go through their process and I review the traffic study, and it has recommendations, I'm checking the study to make sure that everything that's in there, the assumptions are valid. Traffic engineering is, especially when it comes to traffic studies, is a science, but it's also an art. You have to take the data that you're given on, okay, traffic on this roadway today, 50% is going this way, 50% is going that way. Well, what am I building? It's going to be a grocery store. Well, all the residential is over here, so really traffic is probably going to be more generated back and forth from the residential when you're going to the grocery store. So you say, well, I'm going to adjust those trips at 60-40 instead of 50-50 based on existing. Well, that's a little bit of an art, right? To decide that it's going to be 60-40 instead of 65-35. But I'm looking at these assumptions to make sure that they are valid, so that ultimately throughout the process of the study, when you get to the recommendations, we can then say that those are valid. And then, of course, the final result is my determination that the mitigation proposed in the study is appropriate. And if not, then I'm making comments back and forth if I think that this assumption you made was invalid, I think you need to change it. Or you need to check these numbers, or maybe an issue with them. But you can generally look at a site, I can, and kind of determine up front what I think the mitigation is going to be. But then those numbers that go into it are actually what spells it out and supports what ultimately is going to be required. Did that answer anything or not?
Just a follow-up question. Thank you. That was pretty comprehensive. Thank you for that. But one of the things that us as a council have constantly questioned of ourselves when it comes to traffic study, we get the traffic study, the developer contracts with the traffic engineer, and we have a very good one here today, and they give the impact of that specific site. One of the things that we as a council have been concerned about, let's take, we have apartments, and it's on the agenda on 170. Now, the Carter Access Study, Josh, I'm sure you're familiar with that. I think the 2040 counts for 60,000 cars a day on 170. Now, since that time, we put are entitled a very large development on Shortcut Road, Boulevard and 170. We have a couple hundred apartments down by Canterfield, which is the start of Okeechobee Crossing. Entitled another 500 apartments behind Sun City, which would access that same road onto 170. And the entire East Argent thing is going up, and a lot of that will come from Argent Boulevard to 170 in that. So when you say you look out, would all those new developments that have happened since the 170 corridor access, would they be taken into consideration how much more traffic all these things that have been approved, land being cleared, would have on 170 or whatever site along 170 was, development would come up like the one we're dealing with?
In a way, yes. And then also it gets complicated, right? So whenever a traffic engineer is scoping out a traffic study with me and they ask what intersections to study and all that, one of the questions I always ask is, are there any approved developments in the area that we need to consider? If there is something in the immediate vicinity that I have approved a traffic study for, then I will release that to them. If there's something that's conceptualized but not approved, then I will not release that to them yet. Now, where it gets complicated is when you have these very large developments phased out over multiple years that are planning to do some improvements at certain intersections. Another development wants to come in that's much smaller and is going to handle its build out isolated in 2 or 3 years. We might need improvements based specifically on their traffic. They can't depend on these improvements that are going to be constructed by somebody potentially maybe in the future if their project moves specifically at that rate of speed. So we're trying to isolate it to the individual site as best as we can while still understanding and accounting for the other traffic. Now, I will say that even if they aren't including a specific study, like the entire East Argent study into the oil change facility project, then there's still like background traffic growth. There's what has been happening. So if East Argent has been building out at a certain rate, then that's going to be factored in when you look at the traffic counts over the last 5 years to say, okay, ordinarily growth 1% to 2%, but in this area, on this corridor, it's 6%. And so that is factored in so that when you're projecting to the build out of the individual project, you get some of that. But at the same time, again, when there's so much overlap of, well, this project's going to put in this turn lane, but they're not going to need it for 5 years, but this one's going to build and open their doors today, do they then become responsible for it? We have to sort that out on an individualized basis.
And that's one of the things we're struggling with, because if we are approving Project A and it's going to be impacted in 5 years, 10 years, but if we don't require the improvements now on the project that's before us, then they're done. We can't go back to them 10 years from now and say, hey, look, we should have asked you to do this then. And that's where, we struggle a little bit as to what part of the future do we hold a development responsible?
For us, that is to the point where they open their door. We haven't gotten to the point, I'm not saying that we won't, but we haven't gotten to the point where we require a developer to look beyond their opening date and account for any traffic beyond that. They account for from today, the growth that's going to occur until they add their traffic, the traffic that they add on top of that, and we mitigate to that.
So even if a development is entitled, we've passed the master plan, and we reasonably expected that would be 10-year build out. There's a point at which you can't take that into consideration, or does it have to be land cleared? Does it have to start being vertical? At what point can you take into those other entitled projects?
Well, we can take into account the planned growth, or so you might call it vested traffic is the term that's used a lot in the traffic studies. It's one that's already planned. The issue is with the larger developments and the long, growth plan. and having somebody that's opening their door in 2 years to account for all of that traffic is that plan may not come to fruition quite at the pace that they're entitled to. And so again, it's really in the traffic study, I'm always comparing the no build to the build. That's where there's really no argument that it's unfair to anybody. The developer sometimes go, well, I don't need to account for that because that intersection is already bad today. Well, I'm not comparing you to today. I'm comparing if you didn't have your project to if you did have your project. So it tries to eliminate as much as possible all of those unknown factors.
You're asking a lot of questions. Anybody else from the council? And please, although my back's to you, but there's a question. We're here to get the best possible result. If you have a question that we didn't think of, then please feel you can be part of this conversation. Help us out. Thank you.
Mayor, so I got a question, and again, so can you kind of go into what's the local government role in the process? And then you did raise something interesting, which I didn't know, that some communities, you said in South Carolina, have their own independent standards that may be higher than the standards that DOT. So how are those applications reviewed versus the lower standard? I guess we'll say a lower standards of the DOT versus in these individual communities that might have higher mitigation requirements. So can you talk about both of those?
Yeah, so the first question was how can local governments help, I think, or be involved?
Yeah, and what's the role? What's their role and how can they be involved in the process?
Really, what's their role when there's an encroachment permit and they're submitting to local governments? There's a checklist, something that's required, right?
Yes, so you want to know what our role is.
So what's the local government's role in when an applicant submits an encroachment permit, or an applicant submits, hey, I'm gonna do this development and it impacts the roadway. So the TIA, if you could just explain what you believe the local government's role is.
Right, so I just imagine that y'all are looking at the site and y'all are determining what needs to go on in the site, and then you're collaborating with us on what improvements are required out in the right of way. Now, we're looking for what's going on in the right of way and looking for your approval for the internal site. So that is what I see our role is. So we want to do that, collectively. We want to do that together and coordinate and communicate.
Which we do, and I know the answer. I just want to make sure everybody in this room understands that that's what you believe local government's role is in the process. It's a collaborative, cooperative process. Okay.
Right, and a lot of times, the local governments are the ones that are seeing projects first, and the project may change 7 times by the time it gets to us in terms of what they're actually looking to build and what the access will look like and all that. We want to be involved as early as we should, and not a moment earlier just because we have 6 counties and a million things going on, right? So every time the development changes, we don't want to have to take the time to review it again and again. From a second question about the more stringent requirements for TIAs. So there is a thought from some councils that traffic engineers are not to be trusted. And so these couple local governments have an on-call consulting list to do TIAs. And should a developer choose to use someone not on that list, then a third-party review happens from one that's on that list. Their thought being that, the council's thought being that if they're working for the government, they won't make up a bunch of lies. So, no matter how it happens, I'm reviewing it, and I'm not on anybody's side, but, the public side and the state side. So, either way, it doesn't matter to me how it happens. But some of the local governments want to see turn lanes more often than what's required by our standards. So if it's fallen just below the threshold for a right turn lane, but with their more stringent requirements, a right turn lane is required, then that's included in our encroachment permit application and design plans. The catch to that is if an improvement required by a local government is gonna negatively impact another property owner and wasn't gonna be required by us, then we can't allow it unless that property owner is giving their permission. So if someone putting in a right turn lane into their driveway is gonna make the person's property next door not be able to have an access, it's only gonna be internal to now this new driveway. If we weren't gonna require the turn lane in the first place, then it's not possible for us to then have that imposed on that adjacent property. But outside of that, there's plenty of frontage on a site. And we're not requiring a right turn lane, but a local government's requiring a right turn lane. They can put it in all on their own site, don't have to buy right away from anybody. Then we'll absolutely accept it and make sure that it's designed then in conformance with what requirements are.
So how many, Josh, off the top of your head, do you know how many communities do that in South Carolina? Have the additional standards?
There are 3 in the Charleston area that do it, and I also believe that Horry County does something similar, and maybe was one of the first.
So they have the third-party reviewer and potentially some additional, like on the turn lanes or whatever.
So as a follow-up to that question, and by the way, this council is not one of those who distrust traffic engineers, so we're with you, believe me. As a council, we had we have an applicant, and at the first reading, it was the council's thought, and it was passed on first reading, that if because of the number of curb cuts in a third of a mile, that we would like to see on the one, just right in only. And the developer had no objection to that. And so it was passed because we felt that that would make that whole area safe. And then it came back that, okay, that was not allowed. So our desire as a council to have that change done, we don't have that authority to do that. Have requested to have that done.
On a state road, yes, and that's very specific to that type of access.
Yeah, that's.
Let's say, for example, though, that it would be a full access, and you guys wanted it to be limited to right in, right out. That's a different story. We most likely would be allowing that again, pending no impacts to other properties. So you talk about access and safe access. Access management is a good thing, right? So the reduction of conflict points reduces the potential that you have any type of collision. And when you limit some of those conflict points to the less dangerous type, to eliminate angle collisions, you end up more side swipes or rear ends. Those are better than angle collisions. So overall, access management is a good thing. The issue with a one-way driveway is it doesn't work because it's used inappropriately. So if you could guarantee that right in would only be used by right in drivers, then it'd be fine. Problem is, people like to go back the way that they came. I came in that driveway, so I'm going out that driveway. And now I've got somebody trying to exit where it's not wide enough for 2, and geometrically it was made for the right in. So now how do I get around? So there's an access on 278. I think maybe they finally revised it, but it was a right out only, I think. And after delineators and posts and signs and everything, rutting, it just doesn't work. And that's why we don't allow the one-way driveway, with the exception of a fast food chain that has a pair and they operate circularly like this and have a connection between the two. And the driveways, one way in and out, are close enough to each other that everybody knows how to use them.
I would like to pursue that when we get to that agenda item, and so I could understand that a little bit more and keep this on a high-level theoretical basis. I do have one of our council members who's away, but he is watching Hi, Steve. And he has a question. Acceleration and deceleration of anticipated vehicles taken into consideration, such as school buses and large trucks when approving curb cuts and access points. In other words, and this is something we struggle with another applicant. Does it matter if the traffic counts include school buses, large trucks, et cetera?
Yes. In our arms manual, what Julie mentioned, which is, goes into all the main chapter everybody uses for driveway, and intersection, and turn lane requirements are. The table that's in there, right turn lanes, for example, lists the minimum storage and taper lengths required. The storage lengths required go up if there is a high percentage of trucks. The tapers of the turn lanes are based on the prevailing speed of the roadway, regardless of trucks or cars or anything. That's where you're developing the turn lane. So yes, it is impacted. There's a high percentage of heavy vehicles, longer storage.
I might have talked over some people before. Any questions?
When the local, if the local area has some control over what the traffic engineering needs to look like, is there something that has to be encoded in the local ordinances in some way, or the zoning code, or how is that accomplished? Or is it just a matter of opinion and negotiating with the developer what you'd like to see versus what your minimums are?
It has to be in the code to require.
So we would have to have, if Hardyville wanted to get more stringent than the state code, we would have to have some sort of standards encoded in order to be able to do that.
Put it in MCDO. As we're updating our MCDO would be a perfect time to consider that.
And with that, as a follow-up to this question, would that additional standard have to come back to the DOT for approval or not?
So I recommend if you're updating the code to include these, that you don't have a traffic engineer on staff, that you do allow me to provide some input to it after developing the code. But again, if it's something that requires more, it's okay, as long as it doesn't impact adjacent property owners.
George, you have a question?
I'm sorry, what's your first name?
Tim?
Tim, did you say you have 6 regions throughout DOT, throughout the state?
It's actually seven
okay.
engineering districts.
Let me ask, an impression I had when I first came down here 23 years ago when I lived in Beaufort. It's something I hear all the time, and I'm curious, and it's sort of the max view. You've got these regions, and the question is, Hardyville and Jasper County, and maybe this is myth or impression, but a lot of people believe this, is low on the totem pole in terms of resources, and there's other regions, other places that have access to things easier or more access or get more than we do. And some of it's size and all that, I understand that. But in general, the question is, how do you determine when you're going against the other 5, what you're getting for us in this region as opposed to where it's going in other places? And are we, I guess the question is, getting our fair share of what's there as a county and as a city? And a lot of people have that question, and they felt it true in state government, and they feel it's for agencies as well. And I don't ask it in a sense of criticalness, but just this myth that's out there. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit, Tim, and, because you're a guy kind of trying to get resources for your area as opposed to others, I assume, if it's like everything else.
Right. We're given a budget for our district, and it's totally based on miles of state roads in my district and everybody else in the state. They've got a pot of money up there. Columbia gives each engineering district amount to maintain their areas based on road mileage in each area.
To be clear, that's maintenance budget, which is divided in that way.
Yeah.
The myths or conceptions about Greenville gets more money than Charleston and the road project, I think Greenville says Charleston gets more money than them. Tim, they can speak more to it. I don't know about all those funding mechanisms for projects and things like that. But our budget that Tim oversees ultimately is a maintenance budget.
So less developed areas that have less roads will just by get, because it's maintenance, less need for money in the sense of this maintenance. That's helpful because I'm sure you've heard all the myths and beliefs and
Here all
myths
comes
of all information and things like that. It's very helpful. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yes.
I have John,
John one or John two.
let the council go.
Which John? Oh, okay.
Council John.
Okay, got John back here too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just gonna follow up on that one question you, I guess, things that concern, one of the things that concerns me is, when we're talking about these developments, and you had said something I was gonna follow up on, like, say, Project A comes in and, you look at the traffic patterns and whatever, and you make your recommendations and approval, and then say, I don't know, a year later or something, all kinds of things start happening that you did not anticipate when you made that approval. Did you say a while ago that, once you approve it, you don't go back and revisit that?
Right, so for us, they're coming for an encroachment permit. The traffic study is a component of the encroachment permit.
So you wouldn't revisit that, I guess, unless some of the other areas came back to you to revisit it, but you wouldn't do it on your own. I guess is what I'm.
In terms of requiring mitigation of a developer, correct.
The other councilman, John.
I'm with Jeff, just to let you know. What is, we talk about standards, and everybody says standards. That means you're trying to fit everything into a number. Yet, we put in a 462, we put in a light there. Now, 462 during rush hour makes 170 become a one-lane highway. But the standard said that shouldn't happen. How do we stop that? I mean, I think that's what the whole thing is. We have standards, we're going by standards, but these standards aren't doesn't seem to fit into our framework. You have Argent Boulevard. It's low on the, at least when I was down here, it was low on the totem pole. That is unbelievable. Now that coming here, 4 containers backed up on 278 going on to Argent Boulevard. That's not in the standard because they can't get across fast enough to let the other cars. So all of a sudden 278 becomes a single lane. And you also have Ford, the Ford area, that Ford car dealership coming out, and they're getting confused. I mean, standards are something that are great when you have a steady flow, but we're having such an increase. I think the standards have to be looked at. And we have, for example, the county has a development up on 170. And in the traffic study, it says there's no way, no mitigation will ever help that traffic. Yet they're going to ask for an encroachment. Where do you, how much mitigation can you give to these areas and get it correct, make it safe, and make a flow that goes on? You go up 170 in the morning at 8 o'clock, they've got Buford has a school up there that backs up. Again, 170 becomes a single lane. That's not in your study. So when did the standards stop being standards and you have to look at something special? That's I guess my question after all that.
So,
I was hoping there was a question in there.
Yeah, well, it was. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that, and I understand, through my whole life, you always standards, you go in the military, standards. But sometimes, when did the standards become standards, and are they looked at frequently? Are they looked at and say, okay, this standard does not work here? That's, and especially because you don't get involved until after we've made the decision to let them build.
From a storage standard perspective, I think about the design standards more than anything. That's where we're talking about the storage and tapers on turn lanes and the spacing between driveways and such. When talking about traffic studies, I think I used the term accepted practice of the engineer that's doing the traffic study. And so when we're talking about mitigation, again, the developer's responsibility is to mitigate their traffic. All traffic ultimately goes to these larger routes, but widening 170 isn't going to be feasible and reasonable for most developers. So at some point, we do have a requirement to issue an encroachment permit for an access on a roadway, even though the traffic on that roadway is bad because of the amount of commuter traffic back and forth. So we're looking at intersection improvements, turn lane improvements at driveways and such. Solving these much larger problems eventually, unfortunately, fall back to government to essentially solve.
Well, we have 95 logistics is coming in down. When they did the traffic study was between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock. I think that's what they used, right? Well, it's a warehouse. And it's going to be mainly containers coming from the port of Savannah. Port of Savannah, by 9 o'clock, the containers are only starting to come out. Takes about an hour to get a container out of the port. So you don't even look at that in that traffic study. At least that's the way it looked. Do you take into account that because it's a warehouse, that there's a difference between commuting of cars and a commuting of trucks? And they're going to clash.
Right. So whenever you are calculating the trips generated, trip again, that's how many in plus how many out during a given time period. Primarily, you're looking at peak hour. Now, there's two different peak hours. Maybe. There's the peak hour of traffic, and there's the peak hour of the generation, right? So peak hour of a school is in the morning at the same time as the commuter traffic, but in the afternoon, it's not the same time as the commuter traffic. So if a school is doing a traffic study, they're looking at the morning, they also have to include the hours between 2 and 4 because that's their in and out time frame in addition to the PMP. If there's a user that the traffic generation falls outside of that peak hour, then yes, it's considered. Now, first off, do I know every detail about every user and exactly what brand is going to deliver at one time? No. But the thing that also you'll find is the commuter traffic is also lower during those off times. So what's the greater impact really? Is it during the 9 to 10 hour when most commuters are already at work? Or is it the trips generated between the 8 and 9 hour when commuters are still on the road? It's going to have to be site by site if there's some different characteristics, but primarily you're going to pick up that commuter traffic peak because that's the worst of the worst condition.
Okay, we have any other questions? Before we go into B and C, Mike, are you finished with A? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and because they're more specific, but in relation to that and from an objective of this council, specifically relates to B and C. As I mentioned to start, we're as a council being faced with more and more difficult situations, at least for us, to decide what's the best thing for public safety. One of the things that we, as a group, had talked about was, okay, we hear from our staff, we hear from the developer, but a lot of times we'd like to hear from you as well. when we have particularly difficult decisions that are difficult in our minds, can we have someone available to be part of our decision process? Either our first or second meeting? Is that something that's possible in the future?
I think sending something for us to review and providing that feedback, yes. Probably traveling down here for a council meeting at second reading, probably not so often.
Well, we've all learned how to do Zoom. In fact, you appeared on Zoom for us, and I think our council has expressed to me that having SCDOT available to ask questions and to see our way through some of these difficult decisions would be helpful to us. And if we could possibly arrange that, and we certainly can send you all the information that we as a council get beforehand.
I recommend attempting to get the answer from us beforehand. I'm politely declining the coming to the council meeting because I'm coaching softball tonight and I'm coaching t-ball tomorrow. I'm coaching softball the next day and I have church the next day. As much as I can answer or we can answer ahead of time, we will elect that route.
We'll certainly do that. You know, we're all retired, so we're gonna have a nap this afternoon while you're coaching. But, you know, I think just establishing that we want to do the right thing. We're concerned about safety and having your input and availability to ask questions would really be helpful. And a lot of times we get into the conversation and we do the reading beforehand, but a lot of the questions come up, you know, at the time. So it might be more appropriate for the second reading after we all stuff. Okay. Let's go on to item number B. And I guess the first question for you all is, what is the, are you familiar with what this is?
Yes, we are.
Okay. And before I start, let's have another question from Councilman Mears. Argent Boulevard is 45 miles an hour each and for approximately 1 mile, 55 mile an hour in between. I know you love this question, but can you explain? New developments in the 55 will not be there, were not there 3 years ago. So, and then we've asked for some, and I've been opinion about this. All of us who represent people who live on Argent Boulevard, businesses. I have one business on Argent Boulevard. He emails me every Monday about an accident in front of his business here near. But anyway, that's the question. Is there an explanation why it's 55 miles an hour in the middle where all the development that was not there 3 years ago?
Simply the answer of any speed limit is conducting an engineering speed study. It takes into account many factors. The fact that the central portion of Argent is sparsely developed compared to the end is a main reason why 55 has continued to be deemed appropriate in those speed studies. I know we've talked about it several times. I can't recall the exact year that we've last conducted this study. Every time that we have, of course, I've said as conditions change, we'll continue to be willing to monitor. The concerns that we've heard a lot is about speeding in the area, of which any change in a speed limit sign has negligible impact to. And I believe from the enforcement side of it, there has been difficulty because of lack of shoulders and such in the way. So lowering a speed limit to increase non-compliance and still have an inability to enforce would be ineffective.
So if I understand what you're saying, what Councilman Mearsman is saying, the middle part that's 55 miles is the part that's having an increasing amount of development. Sun City on both sides of Argent Boulevard, and that's smack in the middle, there's 500 new homes on one side in addition to what was there and 1,500 on the other side. So just that one intersections and roads are going in and bridges are going up. So I mean, it's there. It's not speculation about the future. There's a project that Pulte has across from the apartments that are 500 apartments, and that's part of what we'll be discussing. So at what point does it become feasible to do a traffic study that takes into all these new developments in the 55-mile-an-hour zone to see if there is a change is warranted?
At any point, really.
At any point.
Yeah, I would just say that, again, I don't recall the last time we did it. Time flies. It could have been a year ago, it could have been 3 years ago. If it was 3 years ago, an update may be appropriate. If it was a year ago, probably.
And it would have to be, because we being the city of Hardeeville, in the summer of 21, we conducted a traffic study of our own because of this development coming in. And subsequently, at Shortcut Road, a light was approved by DOT. In that traffic study, if I recall the numbers, in the 45-mile-an-hour zone, the average speed was 55. Not surprising. And in the 55-mile-an-hour zone, it was 62. So one of the things that we get from our residents who are involved on that road, including me, every day, well, if you reduce the whole road to 45 miles an hour, at least you get the 62s down to 55, you know? So that, but also because of the amount of heavy traffic, heavy vehicles on that road, it would certainly make a lot of people feel safer. So last question regarding that. How do we, the city of Hardeeville, initiate a traffic study that will lead you to determine whether or not different fees for Argent Boulevard would be warranted?
All you have to do is that.
All we have to do is that. So if there's an official way to ask, please, let's ask.
We did just do one in February for one of the projects on this
And
agenda.
that second project.
But if I understand from Josh, they have to do it. It's not, our traffic studies or their traffic studies do not, if we've done a traffic study, would that suffice? Or do you have, or you being SCDOT, do you have to do your own?
We have received traffic speed studies from third parties before and reviewed them and made determinations based on it. That doesn't, I don't know what you're talking about, what the recommendation was, and I don't know what it was based upon. Sometimes bad recommendations are made, so I don't know. But we'll absolutely do it. We can.
So if I understand you, Josh, if we have, like, the city did one in summer of 21, apparently there's been one done recently.
That's the same result as the 21.
So the process would be to submit those to you and ask you to review with an eye to changing the speed.
If I can provide an answer and save days of work of going out and collecting data and processing it, absolutely.
What's the phrase that we said, let me know what we said? Okay, all right. Let's go on to, because I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have a target date to get out of here? Target time?
Softball game tonight at 7.
We'll get you out way before that because I know our game starts long before that. Okay. We have, and we've referred to it a couple of times in our general questions, a 350 unit development coming right off 170. And we did pass first reading, and at the first reading, as I mentioned earlier, the council would have been satisfied with a write-in only act. And the reason we made that request from what is Tide Watch, which has a median left-hand cut and the new proposed road at Green Acres, that is approximately 1/3 of a mile, 3/10, somewhere in there. With the addition of the access point in the middle and the creation of, Green Acres right now is just a dirt road. And the existing business that's not shown there is what's known as a propane graveyard, but it is a business that has a curb cut. So in that 1/3 of a mile, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 curb cuts on a road that's 55 and going 65. There's a median cut both at both ends at Tidewatch and at the new Green Acres. So there's cars making left-hand turns off the median in there. And we thought that with all those curb cuts coming together at the same time, that was really dangerous. We're very concerned about public, nothing else. We're ready to pass this tomorrow, but we're concerned about the public safety of all those curb cuts. And no, really, there's no shoulder in there for anything to happen now. I think there was a deceleration lane plan there. So I guess our question is, how can we make that safe? Are we being overly concerned? Is there a way we can just make that right in? Because there's gonna be the right out can come out at Green Acres Road. That's that little road down there. How do we make this safer? Are we just afraid of our own shadow? Is our concern legitimate? How can you help us?
All right, so this project, in my records, is 1,200 North Okatee multifamily, 300 units. The highest peak hour is the PM 94 entering, 56 exiting, so 150 trips, we call them. I approved the TIA on April the 7th with a right turn lane required at the right and right out driveway on 17. Access, going back to generalities, not this site, any site. We're required to provide access if they're seeking such access. So if they come to us and have a site plan that had only had access on Green Acres Road, no access on 170, of course, the traffic study would reflect that and how the traffic would be generated and distributed, and we would review that, determine what mitigation would be appropriate. But we would accept, most likely, not having any access on 170 if that was the proposal. But if they're asking us for the access, they have the property frontage for it, we're required to give them the access. So then it's safe access. Well, the safest access for that site, which has a raised median up front of it, right in, right out. Can't be any more restrictive than that to be as safe as it possibly can.
So, and this came up, Josh, the Green Acres Road, that's going to be paved and made the full access road. And that would have not only right in and right out, but as I said, there's a median cut there for in. And our first question was, well, eliminate the one in there because there's so many curb cuts. And we were told that that they have to have more than one access. Is that an SCDOT rule?
Fire code. International fire.
No, I understand. And again, so from your perspective, if we just had one access from Green Acres Road, that would be acceptable to you.
It would meet our requirements. Now,
It would meet your requirements.
the caveat would be the traffic study would change. All traffic would then be diverted to that singular access. And the mitigation may change. What's required
And according to your standards, we could not make that middle access, which according to our fire marshal is required. We could not make that a write-in only access point.
Not because of our standards, but because it doesn't work.
Because
It doesn't function, yeah.
So, again, here's what's gone through our mind. If I knew all the answers, then we would not ask the question. But the reason we were concerned about a write out at that particular point, because before you can even put your foot on the gas pedal, you're coming up to the two other guys. They're that close. So if you, and then you have also people making the left from the median cut. So there's a lot of things all happening at the same time. All at the same time, it's a 55-mile-an-hour road, which we know people are going 60. So it just seems like a lot going on in a very tight space. So that, does that concern you from a public safety standpoint at all? I mean, or is it just us?
Solving adjacent parcels issues impossible when we're dealing with one parcel, right? Ultimately, as things build out, they get brought up to a much better level of safety and efficiency operationally and all that. The right in, right out, again, it's compared to the right in only concept. The right in, right out is safer. So we're not reducing it from full to right in, right out. That's what it already is because there's a median there. There's, other than not having the access, the right in, right out is the safest access.
Any other questions? So one way to solve our problem is you're okay with one access at Green Acres Road, but our fire marshal's not okay with only having one access point to the development. So if we found another access to the development at some other point, you'd be okay with that?
Right, yeah, and to something we were talking about earlier, Mike, with local government's role in all of this, we only have authority over what's in the state's right of way. But internal connectivity between sites is very helpful, long-term planning, growth, everything, right? So every trip, every vehicle you can eliminate off of a main roadway and keep it internal is a big difference maker as those begin to add up. So I think, bygone are the days of every individual parcel having their, own entrance and exit on a major route and having, walled off from the ones beside them. It's not the right way to do it, at least having some type of a package interconnectivity. Very beneficial.
Well, if I heard that statement correct, tell me if I'm wrong, because I won't put words in anybody's mouth. If we could, this walled off little development here, it would be better served if we connected it to some other adjacent property.
Yes. Mayor, may I?
Yes.
I have two different things to add to that conversation. Part of it's my experience recently of going to the Canine Resort, which is in Jasper County, right there at Green Acres as well. And I think a big problem is those people that have been there forever and probably didn't have to get permits at the time. I don't know. And I would hope that developments like this, I'm leading if I were an attorney, developments like this are going to help eliminate those problems as we move forward, I would think. I don't know. But also, we did discuss this with Beaufort County and with Jared and oh yes, Julie was on the phone about talking about ultimately having some kind of frontage road system connectivity from Riverwalk all the way back down. And that is our intent ultimately, to keep that flow and everything. But right now we don't have that ability with with what was going on with Riverwalk. Riverwalk was not in favor at all of shared access or having a roadway in. Plus, the only, and I'm a little bit concerned, the only jurisdictional wetlands are on that side up to the north, if I'm correct.
Yeah, there are wetlands bordering that north side.
That was another place that created a hindrance at this moment, but that will be the hope, is to try to get something that'll go down.
And again, what we're faced with is we have to decide now. And we can't rely on hope. And it's a constant struggle for us. Will we approve something now in the hopes that it'll get fixed later? Or do we deny it now and say, get it fixed and then we'll approve it? And that's the tough decision that we as a council, in our concern for public safety, we're faced with. A couple more days of agony before we'll have to face them in front of the council. So if there are no other questions on item number B,
Yeah, that's right there.
I have a couple. So, Josh, right?
Ma'am.
Okay, that's my son's name too. So, looking at that, I went on, did some looking around, and this project recommends an exclusive southbound right turn lane along, based on SCDOT's roadway design manual, 2021, correct? Okay. And the length of the exclusive right turn lane is based on the ARMS criteria in section D4. And that manual is from 2008, correct? Okay, so we have the design manual from 2021 criteria, and then we're trying to fit that information into a criteria from a manual that's 15 years old. How do they gel together?
One of them is the road design manual is the one that's dictating the need for the turn lane.
Okay.
And then the other one is dictating the length.
Okay, so based on the facts that that one is 2008, it's 15 years old, and the current traffic, we're in 2023, and so I'm just trying to wrap my head around current traffic patterns, the traffic volume, and all of that stuff, then squeezed into criteria that's from 2008. I'm just trying
So
to
2008
understand that.
2008 was the last update of the manual, but
Correct.
it applies to 46 counties out of 46 in South
Okay.
Carolina, not just SD 170 in Jasper County.
I get that, but the point I'm trying to make is that the ARMS criteria is 15 years old, okay? And we are jumping off the roadway design manual from 2021, and I'm like, okay, we have current and then we have 15 years old kind of thing. So moving on from there, you talked about the storage length and the taper, and that storage length was recommended from the 2008 ARMS criteria, and it says you're recommending a total of 300 feet, which includes 100 feet of storage and a 200-foot taper. Now, I understand what storage and taper is. Okay, so I went on the National Association for City Transport and pulled some information from there because I just wanted to understand this. And I just took a sample of vehicles because this is a multi-family development. We have to take into consideration school buses and cars, and mom and dad, one has an SUV, dad probably has a pickup truck, whatever. So the length of some of these vehicles that's going to stack in that storage length, a school bus, an average school bus is between 35 to 45 feet long. An average Ford 150, depending on the length of the bed, is about 17 feet plus. The average minivan length is about 16 feet plus, and then the SUV length, an average SUV is 15 feet plus, and then you have to add, the space in between these these vehicles that's then stacked in that storage lane. And then you also have a 200-foot taper. So I'm thinking if you have, let's say, school buses going in the morning to pick up these kids, and they're stacking up to make that turn, and then you have other vehicles behind that. And then pretty soon you're running out of that 200 taper, and now your traffic is backing up onto the right lane of 170. And now you're only creating a one lane on 170 with this traffic just flying 65 miles an hour. So we're creating a backup there. Okay. So another thing that I was concerned about is how wide is that right in, right out turn lane going to be? Because the inner turning radius of a standard school bus is 21.5 feet as required to clear the curve. And at the tightest angle, the rear overhang of the back bumper extends out to 43 feet. And where I'm going with this is how wide is that right turn lane going to be to accommodate all of this? Because based on the swept path analysis of the larger vehicles, how wide will the turning lane and the throat of the right in, right out turning lane be to accommodate those turns? And will the wider turning radius be accommodated by allowing the turning vehicle to use part of the oncoming travel lane? And that's where our concern is with the right in, right out in that one section there.
So to the first part about the ability to fit the vehicles in there that are gonna use the turn lane. This is a free-flowing right turn lane. There's nothing to stop the traffic entering the site other than if someone happens to be on site parking maybe, but there's a lot of throat length to accommodate the amount of vehicles entering the site. So there never should be a time at this particular site that all of those vehicles are attempting to store in that right turn lane at the exact same time. They should be continually moving into the site, whether it's a school bus or 3 school buses. If we were talking about a traffic signal or a school entrance where there's not enough on-site storage for the school and it's backing out into the road because there's a stopped condition for all of them, creating those queues, that's an entirely different analysis on storage lengths and such. To answer your second question about the turning volumes, the geometry of the driveway, based on some of those same factors that you're talking about, our minimum radius is 30 feet for any driveway, but that increases based on the vehicle that's going to use it. So if it is an industrial site, it's going to have a lot of tractor trailers turning in. There's a program that you can use to show that path of the vehicle to make sure that the radius is designed to accommodate that larger vehicle. But the standard, either 30 foot or a lot of times they're right in, right outs because of a channelizing island, it's actually a 40-foot radius, will accommodate the passenger vehicles and school buses and fire trucks.
Okay, so you're saying, so this project will have a decel right turn lane, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so the decel right turn lane is going to be 300 feet, is that what?
100-foot storage, 200-foot.
Okay. So, going with all these vehicles that I told you about, let's say after school, all the school buses coming in and parents picking their kids up, whatever the case may be. I mean, do you still think just 300 feet is feasible for all of that?
Yes.
But that's based on your criteria from a manual that's 15 years old.
At this point, you're questioning the validity of the manual.
No, I'm not questioning the validity of the manual, I'm just questioning, like, you're having present day 2023 issues that's being, where you're using a 2008 manual to make these recommendations.
Can I jump in? for a
Sure.
second? Because let's just say, with Valerie's concern, this goes back to the question of local, what we could do. You have 100 feet and 200 taper, right? Could we, as a council, require, even though it's not in an ordinance, could we require it to be 300 to?
Or make it longer?
Yeah, that's
Can
what
we
I-
make it longer
Can
than
we
the
make it
three
longer?
hundred feet, or
Can we
maybe the
require
two
the
hundred feet
developer to
longer
make it
taper?
longer?
You could, again, without impacting other properties, and then also to eventually you get to a point where, no, if you said, well, we want it to be a 400-foot storage and a 200-foot taper, that would be a lot of room for vehicles to enter that turn lane at different times, which may then create issues.
Okay.
But if you wanted to increase it by 25 or 50 feet, that would be acceptable.
Some of this is counterintuitive when I read those traffic reports and stuff. What you think is the right answer always isn't necessarily the right answers. And it also sounds like to me that Valerie's point's a good one, but the consideration of those gaps of time is not something that stumped you or is new to your thinking. I mean, you've taken that into consideration as going is what I'm assuming.
Right, so all of our design manuals are have a derivation from federal design manuals, and they also are not updated annually by any means. The traffic control manual that I use as a traffic engineer the most was last updated in 2009. We've been waiting on the next update for at least 5 years because it's just been coming, but it just hasn't gotten there yet. We're gonna have an update to our arms manual in the next 18 months. I don't know that those values that you're presenting are going to change even in that update.
So that's not a stumper to you?
No.
So will this development have an acceleration lane?
No. No.
Why is that?
Acceleration lanes come with other dimensions that are required to make them reasonably safe. There is no way that this development could construct an acceleration lane here that would be designed safe. The length of acceleration lanes, 1,300 feet plus.
Yeah.
You would begin to cross the frontages of many other properties and many other driveways, thereby introducing that extra lane for them to enter without having enough room for them to accelerate. So it could be done right if you could just install that acceleration lane from here all the way to 278 and just tie it right into the on-ramp. That would be long enough, but we're taking them out where they're too short. We have a safety project on 278 that's removing some acceleration lane. They either needed to be extended several hundreds of feet or removed so that it can be down to a yield or stop condition.
So, I mean, we all agree that an acceleration lane is where the most complex transition occurs when when a vehicle is entering a road with that kind of speed. And it requires the longest distance to perform the lane shift safely. So if they're going to go right in, right out, and they're going to do a right out onto 170 where people are flying at 65 miles per hour, I mean, shouldn't we be concerned about their safety? I mean, I would hate, because I mean, that's where like most of the really bad crashes will happen and people can lose their lives. And I don't know if we want that on our conscience.
So if you were to eliminate that right out at that location, where should they go to take
Oh, I
the
don't
right?
know, you're the expert, you tell me.
It would be green acres.
Right, another intersection. So the difference between the two intersections is there's a few of those access points nearby, which is what y'all's concern was. But at some point, someone's gonna have to turn right onto 170 and choose a gap in traffic that's acceptable for them to make that turn.
Have you driven on 170 during rush hour?
Yes.
How long ago was that?
Recently enough that
Well, you get, Valerie's question just speaks to what, our concern about safety. We see it, we drive it every day, we feel it, our neighbors feel it, and so that's why those questions. As a follow-up from a resident, this will be the last one, I forgot it before. This is from a Mr. Robert Coleman who lives in Sun City. He has other things in here, but as it pertains to that conversation, we have a 50-foot buffer on this, right? This is a 50-foot buffer. He raised the question, and this may be a permitting question. He raised the question that along 170, he uses Canterfield, for example, which is a little further down. That has a 145-foot setback. Tidewatch ER, which is also near there, is 120-foot setback. And it speaks to your point where there's always a free flow, right? Would a larger setback help with the safety of this situation? Is that something, because it certainly has precedent along 170, is that something that you look at in your permitting process?
We do have required throat lengths, which is the distance we require from the edge of the travel lane to the first
Stop.
movement of any kind, like driveway or access road. And so that changes based on what you're building. You know, if you're building something that could be signalized, it of course gets longer. If you're building just a commercial driveway, then it could be 30 feet, which would allow one car to turn in and stop while somebody's backing out of a parking space. So of course, the longer the throat distance, yes, it does.
It
It does
prevents
help.
that, what Josh was saying, it
Yes.
prevents you that free flow, so
That's
there's,
right.
there's not that need for the longer detail because they can come right in and get up to the first point of the
They have
stop.
room to maneuver inside the site.
So Mr. Coleman is suggesting that, you know, we increase the size of that setback. Again, Mr. Coleman is a resident, and that's something he's sent to us. That's for us to decide on. But I just wanted to get that in. Thank you. Any other questions regarding item B? Yes.
Can I ask a question, Mayor? I have a question about the local standards that you referred to that a couple of places have adopted. That local standard that's adopted, is it part of their zoning code?
Yes.
So it's an overlying standard that would have to apply to all developments, not just site-specific development. And then you would review it to see whether or not it had a negative impact on neighboring properties to make your determination on whether that local standard would be applicable or would be acceptable to the DOT.
Right, if it's going above and beyond what we're required.
So the final determination of those standards still lies, for the right of way, still lie within the DOT.
If it's on a state road, yes.
We didn't have one in the MZDO prior to the latest revision. It was taken out at that time. It just went with the DOT, but we had one there before.
Okay, let's go on to Argent to the commercial project on 442. Now, as I mentioned, Argent Boulevard, there's nothing that causes us more angst than Argent Boulevard. We have, Mike, I had asked for, can we have an overview, like a GIS map of Argent Boulevard and how it backs up to 170. So what we're faced with on this project, I'm sure you know, is the entrance point to this project, which again, no objection, is directly across from an apartment complex that has, I think, what was it, 500 apartments, and has a history, nothing in 2022, but something like in the 3 previous years, something like 12 accidents before any of all these new developments that have gone on along Argent Boulevard. So the first thing we were concerned about was having this, the only entrance into this project be directly across, which would be a T intersection. From this apartment complex that has a history of accidents. And now we're gonna add this, and it would be, as Mr. Mearsman's question referred to, these would be a lot of heavy semis, debris, trusses, building, and a lot of work trucks coming in. So at the council meeting in the first reading, we raised that concern about having that intersection be directly across from there. We also brought up the fact that the plan calls for, and this is a term I recently became familiar with, they have suicide lanes, left-hand turn lanes facing each other. I'm familiar with them from a driving standpoint, and they're scary as hell. So we raised the point, well, can't we put the access in some other point so it doesn't conflict with that apartment complex? It eliminates the need for those suicide lanes. And we were told that the DOT manual, I guess, prefers T intersections and not offset. But what I'm thinking is, one, entirely away from it, not offset, which offset means just a little bit, right? But having access at totally some other point. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe. So is this across from Village Drive?
Yes.
Okay. So this one, I have listed as warehouse and mini storage. It fell below our threshold to require a full traffic impact analysis, but we did require a turn lane analysis. And we approved in December a left turn lane at the site access, and we also placed a requirement that when we're looking at their site layout, that they reserve space for the pending future Argent widening and potentially a roundabout at this intersection, because we don't know what the ultimate traffic control would be. As far as access location, absolutely right. If we have a frontage that has an existing intersection and the development access cannot be located separately such that it meets our standards, then we want it to be aligned. Now, when you say located entirely away, as long as it meets those spacing standards, then it would be eligible for full access at that location. I believe we'll be talking about around 400 feet for this particular location. If they don't have enough site frontage for that spacing, then it's going to end up needing to be aligned for full access. Otherwise, they get restricted to a right in, right out.
So they would be restricted right in, right out.
If they can't meet, they can't align or meet spacing for full access.
Or meet spacing. So it either has to be that T intersection with the suicide lanes, because there's a left-hand turn into Village Drive already. There's a turning lane there. And so with the left-hand turn lane that's being proposed, they would be facing each other because the intersection would be right there. So the other option of putting the full access space has to be 400 feet from Village Drive.
Right. So
In either
it's
direction.
a table and again, the ARMS manual from 2008. It's based on speed. And so the higher the speed, the greater that spacing has to be.
Well, it's 55 miles an hour
We
unless
know
you
that.
lower it to
We know
45.
So 400 feet spacing.
So it has to be.
For full access.
Before I turn it over, I'm also going to go back to a suggestion by Mr. Coleman, which is why I asked for this to go up there. Do we have a pointer that I can? What Mr. Coleman has been suggesting to the city council for quite some time is, how do I do this?
Green button.
Okay. So this is Sun City and the project right here, and this is Village Drive, right? So here's the project that we're considering. What Mr. Coleman's suggestion is that we would, rather than have have access here, to add either in addition to, put a connector road that would connect either Schindler Avenue or forget what this name of the road is here. And so then they would have access to come out here and go to 170 instead of Argent Boulevard or in addition to Argent Boulevard. Does that make any, do you have any comment about that? Josh, does that have any validity for Mr. Coleman?
Sounds like interconnectivity to me. So whether they do have access across from Village Drive or not, the interconnectivity could be a good thing potentially.
Okay, so there would be no objection from an SCDOT standpoint to connect from Village Drive and connect to 170 via either Schindler or I forget what the name of it.
So those other roads are probably off system for us anyway, so we wouldn't even review the connection to them.
Okay, so, all right, so that, now, just in general, maybe there's other engineers then.
Triangle piece. So you gotta go a little further up, not that, there, a little up. That's the site right there.
That's it, okay,
Yeah.
this is Village.
That's Village Drive and
This
those
is
are part of
Village.
Village.
Okay, thank you, you know, I don't have a road sign in front of me, I'm totally. Okay. So just in general, maybe one of the engineers could chime in to take the heat off of it. Let's say that was a viable option, to have that connectivity from the back of this triangle to, let's say, Schindler Road that goes to 170. What would have to be done in order to accomplish that? In terms of, would right of ways have to be purchased? Does it go through wetlands? Anybody?
Yeah, I can speak to it some. So whenever, I think it was our first reading that we did, or if it was the council meeting that we had together, before the first reading, there's a wetland behind it that would block from Riverwalk. And then the Riverwalk intersection at 170 fails pretty bad. So you're just moving the problem in a sense. So you're saying you want that interconnectivity, but your interconnectivity there is through the businesses of Riverwalk into then you get to Riverwalk and that's a failing intersection.
What he is suggesting is not going through Riverwalk, making a connecting road from Village.
I think you need to zoom in there.
To go to Schindler.
You need to zoom in on that, see what's really going on. I'm looking at that.
This is Schindler Avenue. You remember Trash Mountain? Schindler Avenue goes to 170. It ends here. It was somewhere in here.
Yep.
So it doesn't go, it goes to the side, and the new development of Sun City is over here. So what he's suggesting.
No.
No? No, it's over here. So what he's suggesting is taking a road through Oakley's property and connecting it to Schindler. Here. Here.
Yeah, it curves around.
Yeah, the side of that is a massive wetland, so our site plan would show it too. So that connectivity right there is blocked by the wetland very close to your cursor there.
Okay, so again, I'm asking the question for Mr. Coleman, and I think it's, I want to make sure that we answer him properly. So in order to have connectivity to Schindler or this other road, it would have to go through a wetlands area that would prohibit that from happening.
Right, you would have to go through wetland for that interconnectivity, that's correct.
And generally, we don't
Have roads go through wetlands? You can have roads go through wetlands. It goes through a permitting process that's through the Army Corps of Engineers. So you can have it depending on our acreage of impact, being where that connectivity has. If I can borrow that cursor real quick? Right? All right, so all of this right here is wetland. And so if we're trying to connect back to here, you're connecting through a massive bit of wetland. So you're looking at quite a bit of mitigation and stuff, and that one may not be allowed. So we'd have to work through Army Corps of Engineers for it. And then for our development and the number of trips that we're generating, to me, from my perspective, it seems like overkill.
Okay, thank you.
And I wanted to, we go this, and who's control.
Yeah, shoot.
I just wanted to ask a question for
Sure.
clarity, because I know I get brought up Thursday. All right, so where we're aligned with Village Drive, we try to do the offset intersection. We don't have the frontage to then build our turn lanes here. And then over here, we're in conflict with other driveways across the way. So we're really, really limited on where we can move our driveway, which is why we have it aligned with Village Drive. So that's why we're aligning here, is one, that's what the ARMS manual suggests, is to align driveways where possible. And then the second point I want to point out too is that if we look at restricting our access to a potential right in, right out, we would need to put up a median on Argent. I know one's not a Dreamscape. I don't know what that agreement was, but in accordance with design manuals, we should have a median on Argent, which then would impact the Village Drive residences. They would no longer be able to make a left turn in or a left turn out of their development. They would be right in, right out if the median went up for our access point.
I think for Dreamscape, the median was inside.
You have the porch, right? So you have the little median island on Dreamscape.
It's in the interior.
So it needs to be on Argent so that whenever you're trying to, if you wanted to turn left, you'd have to avoid the pork chop, but then you would hit the median. So you would want the median on Argent to meet their proper design guidelines there, which would then affect Village Drive. They would no longer be turned left in and left out. And I'm not sure from DOT's perspective, if I can ask a question, would y'all allow a right in, right out across from existing full movement, or do you want both sides to remain full movement?
If it was aligned, it would be full access and not right in, right out.
So, just going back to what you advised before, do you know how many feet from here to here and how many feet from here to here?
I could scale it up. I had it before.
But we would have to, Josh, we would have to 400 feet in order to have a full access other than at Village Drive.
And we would also have to have the distance for the turn lane and taper to be on the site frontage as well, or else we're impacting an adjacent property owner.
So over here, which is right now undeveloped, if this was
relocated, you're creating an offset, and we would still be in the influence area of the left turn lane into Village Drive. So we also can't be in the influence area of an adjacent intersection. And so for that left turn taper that's existing into Village Drive, it almost ends at our property line.
Right.
So we have to be outside of that influence area before we can put in our access point. And we also have to build in a right turn lane, which would then take us out of our property line.
So now, so according to Josh, that is 400 feet. So do we know how much this here is?
Let's just see if I can scale it up.
The other question that came up, Josh, and you probably, it's not under your, maybe it's under permitting. While he's looking up that. We just had this conversation. The fire marshal wants to have, requiring us to have more than one access. One of the conundrums that we have, being, mere citizens. But we're allowing only one here. Fire is fine.
Multifamily and residential versus this, and Steve can address that.
It's basically based on life hazards, so it's the number of people that will be occupying that at any one given time. And once it reaches a certain point, which is generally not reached until you have a multifamily section.
About how we've addressed that, we will, what we've allowed recently are stabilized earth accesses. And so it's not a driveway that people recognize as a standard driveway, but it's stabilized so that emergency equipment can get in and out of the site without installing a real driveway.
And that's exactly what we did. I don't know if you're familiar with the school, there is a section that goes into the middle of the school area that's actually designed for our trucks to drive on. But you can't see it because it's covered with grass, so that is an option.
It can be gated also internally with a
Great
lock
idea.
box.
Great idea.
That very, very tip, and that's from a paper scale. I'd go back and measure it off in the office, but the very left edge of the property line, that red line, is like right at 400 feet. So if we put our access point there, there's some type of road right next to it there. I don't know if that's an official encroachment, so we wouldn't meet spacing from whatever that you can kind of see it grayed out there. So I don't know what that is. So if we went 400 feet and we did our turn lane, we would be on somebody else's property line at that point and affecting other properties. And if that property owner doesn't allow us to take right of way, then we're in a tough spot because they won't do condemnation for private developments. That's not what DOT does.
You'll be at a tough spot Thursday too.
So I am fully aware.
So, if you could have that question, and I don't think, we would hold them, we've been very generous with the time, but those questions we would move forward on Thursday. So I would suggest you're prepared with those distances because the council does have concerns. Okay. Anybody else want to clicker? Who else has a question?
Yeah, can I say anything?
No, anybody but you. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Marcus Weeder. I'm with Bill Point. Previous project, but didn't want to interrupt Victor's Jesse. The one thing that was, a couple things. One thing that was discussed in the meeting 2 weeks ago that didn't get fleshed out because the gentleman's not here today. Can you speak to the volumes between commercial and multifamily? There's been some concern over, because the property that I'm dealing with is entitled commercial now. We're actually trying to go to multifamily. So there's been conversation back and forth on what you go do right now and the kind of volume that would potentially create versus what we're proposing.
Right, so it'd be, again, whatever the use is by right commercially, could be a whole host of things, because there may be different types of commercial zoning. So a convenience store, if it's eligible to build that, would be substantially higher than a multifamily, because it would be traffic at least as high as that multifamily, probably in the peak hours, and then more throughout the rest of the day as well. But if it was a daycare, which is also a potential commercial facility, it may resemble your multifamily development.
Historically, generally commercial is going to be higher.
Generally, commercial will be higher for a more intense, medium to high intensity commercial development. And commercial is gonna most likely generate more throughout the middle portions of the day as well, just because of the retail nature of whatever.
Okay. Can we go back to the? Sure. Can I follow the speaker?
Oh, this controls it?
Oh, I don't know. I was trying to do
No,
the. some discussion being had about, I guess, coming off, taking the right turn and the throat length. Is the length from the right of way into this first intersection really that we have, that would be included in that throat distance, would it not? I mean, essentially of where a car would be going before it would be in.
So that wouldn't, that would be the throat distance, not the turn lane storage length.
Right.
But obviously this is not dimensioned. It looks like substantially more than what DOT's requirement is because of the fact that the zoning ordinance has those buffers required. Our throat distances in the arms manual when it's not a traffic signal are pretty low. So this will exceed what DOT requires for throat.
Yeah, and thank you guys for coming. My biggest thing is ultimately we're at the mercy of what the city and the DOT agree to. So we stand ready, willing, and able. I mean, all the way into including you talked about interconnectivity. I mean, if there needs to be an easement here because it's not viable right now, but you guys want it in the future, I'm happy to provide it. Again, we're kind of at the mercy of what the two entities are agreeing on. So whatever grounds can be made there, we'll stand willing and able to implement them. Thank you.
Mayor, I have one last
You didn't take
question.
our clicker, did you?
It's right here.
Check his pocket. Okay.
One last-
In the room, chief.
One last question, really for clarification with Josh. So right-hand offset in the arms manual, would that be applicable to Village Drive? Because it's more than the full access spacing. So it's a 700-foot for the turn lane developments, because we'll have the left turn lane into Village Drive and then we need a left turn lane into ours. So would this one, the 700 feet be applicable versus the 400?
I want to think that's in the intersections section of the manual, talking about kind of realigning skewed intersections and creating that offset, and those dimensions are based on the turn lanes, like what you're talking about, being able to fully develop those. When we're looking at site driveways, it's going to be the spacing of the site driveways. Absolutely a valid point about turn lanes and how they are constructed, that we wouldn't want a full access that falls within the storage or taper of another existing turn lane. If it falls just outside of that, then potentially be eligible. It really, again, depends on turn lane designs and how
So
those
this is not
interconnect.
exactly for the site access, that's for free line. Okay. Wanted to make sure. Here's the clicker.
All right.
I ran away.
Yeah, the chief's watching you guys.
Yeah.
All right, again, I want to thank you very much. I'll entertain any other questions from council. Any other questions from the public or staff? While we have this. Okay, once again, on behalf of the council and staff, thank you. This has been, I don't know about anybody else, but asking these questions and getting good answers is really something. Please, wait. Is really something that's quite helpful. I don't know that it solved my sleep problem because I still have to make some decisions, but it certainly went a long way, and I thank you on behalf of the council. Thank you very much.
No, that's it. We'd have to.
I think we need a motion to adjourn.